Greetings and welcome to Trinity Radio Extra. I'm Johnathan Pritchett, and today I have my dear friend Nick Quient. Say hi, Nick.
Hi, Nick.
All right, and we're going to talk about the apocalyptic perspective on Paul today. This is an issue in scholarship that has been around for quite some time. Scott McKnight recently commented a couple years ago how the only things going on in Pauline studies now is basically squabbles between the new perspective on Paul and the apocalyptic perspective on Paul. And when it comes to the old so-called Lutheran Paul, and I guess you could toss in the Reformed Paul, nobody cares. In fact, not very many major works on Paul from that camp has made much of a dent. I know Paul Westerhelm, is it Westerholm? Or Stephen Westerholm.
Yeah,
Stephen Westerholm.
McMaster, yeah.
Yeah. He's still trying to wave the flag, but nobody cares. Right.
Well, I mean, Francis Watson, although Francis Watson's kind of in all four camps at once. It's a little weird.
Yeah. In fact, I read his book. It's on the shelf. I can't remember the name of it, but it was the second edition where he pretty much revised everything from the first edition and walked away from his, most of his new perspective leanings. The title's long, so I can't think of the name of it.
What is it? It's Paul and the Hermeneutics of Faith. Was that it?
No. Well, since you're getting up, this is Trinity Radio Extra. I can get up.
Yeah, we can get up while we want. So I don't have my headphones in. I got a baby over here, y'all. So that's how we do.
That's my default. I don't know what I'm doing.
It's Paul and the Gentiles or something like that, isn't it?
Judaism and the Gentiles. Here we go.
That's what it is, yeah.
Yeah, revised and expanded. It should have just said rewritten because this was beyond the new perspective. So he's kind of, there's a whole thing in there. He tries to work his way back around to Augustinianism and that by way of new perspective and some other. It's weird, but yeah, Stephen Westerholm's still waving that flag, but it's not really moving a whole lot of the discussion.
You can find most of the proponents teaching at RTS or Master Seminary, one of those. Kind of the last holdouts or kind of the more conservative reform seminaries.
But as far as the church goes, the new perspective had been out for 25, 30 years before people started to get wind of it. And, teaching in a seminary, we've got a lot of students who are coming in, and when they want to write theology papers, especially in my contemporary theology, where we talk about different takes on justification, which I'm sure we'll get into a little bit today, they want to have their say for and against the new perspective. And I'm like, yeah, that's kind of old hat now. We got to talk about this now because it's really just now catching up. But unfortunately, a lot of people's first exposure to the apocalyptic Paul was when N.T. Wright released Paul and His Recent Interpreters shortly after he made the big splash with Paul and the Faithfulness of God, and a large chunk of its engagement with the apocalyptic perspective. So they're getting a lot of critique as their first exposure to it. For those who actually read that book, but it's a pretty popular book. But not a lot of engagement with Campbell and those guys, just the introduction. So why don't you explain broadly where it is? Because like the new perspective, that's an umbrella term for perspective. Same with the apocalyptic perspective is an umbrella term for. So why don't you briefly give people kind of an overview of what that is, since you are at least for Trinity Radio, you're our resident Pauline scholar. I think Paul's overrated, as everyone knows. I'm a Peter guy who.
Well, the more I'm studying the Gospel of John, the more I'm like, John's kind of where it's at.
But John's where you want to go now. Okay.
I'm liking John, but that's because John is, I think, very apocalyptic too. So
yeah, a slightly less enormous body of literature to have to sort through, right? Than Pauline studies. Yeah.
At least I think the patristics have a lot more fun with John than they
Yeah.
do.
Well, of course they do, but you can do if you're a patristic, you can do whatever you want with any of it.
What was it? You wouldn't have without the Gospel of John, Athanasius wouldn't have been able to defend the deity of Christ, and if it wasn't for the Gospel of John, Arius wouldn't have been able to make his case for the subordination of the Son. So,
yeah, the things that they were actually interested in, rather than 2,000 years later, we're fighting over Paul and have a mountain of literature to wade through. But like I said, I'm a Peter guy, and I grant that Peter did his share of, well, and maybe for another time we could talk about who wrote First and Second Peter, but I think he did his fair share of, I won't say plagiarism, but honoring Paul with some shadow language, but less to read, and I'm lazy in those terms. So I like Peter, but you're a Paul guy, so we don't want your years to go to waste before you jump ship to Johannine studies. So give us what the apocalyptic perspective on Paul, and then where you situate yourself in that as soon as you get back. Nick is doing more important daddy duties while he's doing this. So there we go. Makes the screen better.
My son was, I could tell, beginning to teeter on the brink of a meltdown. So he's sitting right here with us. So
that's perfectly fine with us. We don't mind babies making noises in church, and we certainly don't mind adding some beauty to the screen, because you and I, yes, not so much. Right.
So we'll see how he behaves. But yeah, the apocalyptic position or positions, the one kind of core you can kind of find with, so for example, the Lutheran Paul, right? Or the Reformed Paul, whatever, or however you want to categorize that, is concerned with an individual standing before God. So it's concerned with the God-human relationship, but we would say on probably an individualistic level in terms of understandings of law and covenant, justification having a primarily or even exclusively forensic legal construct kind of idea. The new perspective said basically the idea of an individual understanding is myopic. It doesn't address Second Temple Jewish texts, and it also doesn't bring in the idea of culture. And so the new perspective on Paul, which is almost as we would call it the Jewish perspective on Paul, or an attempt to understand the Jewish perspective on Paul, is basically saying Paul's the Second Temple Jew. You should interpret him under those categories in conversation with, Sirach and Philo and Josephus and all of them. And it seems that the concern for them that kind of guides it is the idea of ethnocentricity, the fact that the Jews, according to Paul, or Jewish people, had a belief in a ethnic corporate election. They're elected based on their ethnicity. And Paul seems to say no. And so there is some truth to that idea as well, because Paul doesn't, the famous text in Galatians 3:28, there's neither slave nor free, Jew nor Gentile, and so on and so forth. And so, and there is that kind of contention and tension in Acts 15 and Acts 10 and all those sorts of issues of law and how the Gentiles are incorporated in the church. And so that's kind of where the new perspective kind of drew its first blood. It was never about justification, or at least as I understand, it was never about justification or imputation or any of those things that the Lutheran Paul seemed to really prioritize, although it did address them. The apocalyptic Paul basically came in and said, generally speaking, of course, that the new perspective, while attempting to eradicate the notion of Paul, of Jews being ethnocentric, anti-Semitism, basically said, in doing that, basically fell into anti-Semitism by the idea of Paul reacting against Judaism as a construct, therefore implying that there's something wrong with Judaism.
Right. So one of Douglas Campbell's complaints was, in the new perspectives, trying to demonstrate that Second Temple Judaism wasn't so much of this slavish, works-based,
right,
hope you turn out okay in the end, and demonstrate its more gracious foundation. It just replaced that with a sense of ethnocentrism that right. didn't seem to fit its way. And I think Michael Bird has done a lot of work in Jewish proselytization during the Second Temple period, where so that whole charge seems to stick, that in an attempt to rescue Judaism from the anachronistically Catholic idea of Judaism, right. so to speak. They saddled it with a different problem that didn't seem to fit either, which is this sort of, there is a degree of where, it's Torah focused, but it wasn't as if all first century Jews were just bigots and you even get that in the pulpit, right?
Right.
but that, those first century Jews, they just thought they were better than everybody else and all of this.
Yeah, they had earned their way into God's grace. I mean, what was
Right.
E.P. Sanders, Paul and Palestinian Judaism? One of his
Yeah.
famous lines in there was, Paul's problem with Judaism was that it wasn't Christianity.
Right, yeah.
And it's one of those where it's like, on some sense, that's true, but it assumes that Paul basically had to step out. If a worldview is a house, right? Paul
Yeah.
basically had to step out of the Jewish house, the Jewish epistemological house, in order to find something completely new. And the new perspective basically argued that, and that's the old perspective kind of concept, right?
Right.
The new perspective basically said, no, Paul stayed in the house, but he had to rearrange a lot of the furniture and knock down some walls here, and he had to reconstruct, but he kept the sort of the structure of the house. And the apocalyptic folks come in and say, basically, it doesn't, and their big charge, and it's one I'm ambivalent towards, I actually don't like, because I think it tends towards supersessionism and even anti-Semitism if interpreted wrongly, is that Paul basically didn't have any need for Judaism because he had Christ.
Yeah.
And there's this kind of Paul, and there's this, they emphasize, they'll use language like divergence or invasion to kind of display something like in the idea of God has done something new that cuts off the story of old. Or in some positive construals like mine, it's God brings those threads, those disparate threads, into one's thread in Christ, right? And so that's why, but there is a very disjunctive view of history within the apocalyptic sphere where Judaism and the law and all those sorts of things are kind of either subsumed, or we shouldn't say subordinated under the Christ event, or cut off. And then the question then becomes, what of the law, what of God's promise, what of all these sorts of things? And at that point, flip a coin, you're going to get a million different answers with the apocalyptic folks. And that's why I'm critical of the apocalyptic school, because I think it's a convergence of the ages and of the narratives, but not a disjunct, not a severance or subordination of them.
Right. So like with dispensationalism or anything else, when you have readings of Paul and say Torah or law or whatever, or some people set it up law and gospel, you have this spectrum of continuity and discontinuity. And what you're saying is some people in the APP go too far in the discontinuity end of the spectrum. But so I guess in a very charitable way, you could say that what the APP wants to say is that it's not a matter of the house and rearranging the furniture. It's that the house had been relativized along with all other powers and nations and everything else going on in the world.
Yeah, the house, they tore down the house to build something else.
Right. Well, or just made it, or demonstrated that the house doesn't matter. Right. Anymore.
Right. That too. Yeah. Depending on the perspective, but yeah, those two are yeah.
But the worst would be Paul set the house on fire instead. That would be the worst. That would be the ugliest way you could say it for.
Oh yeah. Paul basically not only did Paul set the house on fire, but he left all his Jewish brothers and sisters in there to burn.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And there's that kind of and the tendency of the apocalyptic Paul, and this is a critique from someone within that movement, is that it essentially emphasizes Christian theology at the expense of Jewish history.
Yeah.
And so you get kind of Bardian notions of revelation and incarnation. And don't get me wrong, I affirm all of that. I'm fine with all that, but I see that as a both and rather than an either or. I don't think Paul burned his Jewish house down. And I don't think he threw out Philo and Josephus as horrific people. I think you put Philo and Paul in coordination and conversation, a lot of them, at least when it comes to atonement and purity, they're on the same page. The only difference is Paul has the additional element of the Christ event that begins to reshape the notion of what it means to have a house in the first place. But that doesn't mean he burned everything down. It means everything now is seen through the prism of this Christ event, this incarnational Christ event.
Yeah. So for a lot of people new to this idea, a lot of the focus, of course, naturally goes to Romans. And say if you're an APP person like Douglas Campbell, for example, you recently had a debate. I can't forget the name of the gentleman. He's a very friendly guy. I've seen him around. What was his name?
David Lewis, I believe.
David Lewis. I've seen him.
Nice guy.
Yeah, he was on Late Flowers program a couple times. I knew I recognized him from somewhere. Very, very nice gentleman. unfortunately relied a little bit too much on reading Moo's commentary, which but that's okay. At least he read wider than Moo, but um, he was familiar with your position, but he didn't seem, and there's not a knock against him because this happens a lot when it comes to Greco-Roman rhetorical devices, right? So the debate was on Romans 7, and prosopoia was you were setting up, and you and I differ on this, but your position is what that is a speech in character.
Yeah.
And so you were having to unpack all of that in that debate and try to demonstrate certain things. But Campbell takes that and he reads that into chapters of Romans 1:18 all the way through chapter 4 as a back and forth between Paul speaking in character with an opponent.
Yeah.
And then he says when Paul finally gets to state his case with his full voice, that's Romans 5-8.
Right.
And that's his gospel, not so much what people normally think of when they read Romans, especially Romans 3. Because I was looking up at how they break that the dialogue back and forth down. So are you on board with that project? Or do you think that Paul basically see? I see a diatribe through there, but I don't see that device working. Where I don't see those rhetorical cues there. But I was wondering if you did.
Yeah, there's no what we call deictic markers, right?
Yeah.
Certain rhetorical great Greek particles used in certain rhetoric to indicate either shifts or tweaks or kind of in terms of aspect, right? It'll shift what is being said, kind of the what then, or therefore what is this, kind of introducing a question or a device of some sort. You don't see that in Romans 1-4 really. You see it in Romans 3 where you have a diatribe at the beginning of the chapter 1-9, where Paul does have some sort of, I wouldn't say dialogue, that's not precise, but
it's more rhetorical questions that an interlocutor that he's probably heard in synagogue.
Rhetorical tactician, yeah. Paul's basically he's putting words in someone's mouth. So it's not appropriately speech in character, but it's in the same sort of family. Quintilian would be very happy with what Paul's doing. Yeah. The issue I see with Campbell's work is there's no rhetorical markers of that sort in Romans 1 and 2, really. Or at least in the sense that he wants there to be. So he wants to say that Romans 1:18-32 and following is Paul's Jewish interlocutor kind of speaking. The problem with that is what that person says throughout Romans 1-8 is just kind of a standard vice list, but also if you incorporate Greco or even rhetorical ideas of the decline of civilization narratives, right? And all those sorts of things. If you include all that, Paul operates with that all over the place. There's a dozen or so vice lists in Paul that echo Romans 1, or at least are coordinate in meaning.
Right.
So it's one of those where it's like you have to show why Paul is doing something different here. And what I think Paul is doing differently in Romans 7 is I think there are deictic markers to indicate something like that. And there are, of course, debates on that, or at least the meaning of those, but no one disputes that's what Paul's doing. They debate on what he's doing or on how he's using them, not that they're there.
And who is the I?
Yeah.
Is it Paul? Is it representative of Adam, like is your position? Some people say, well, it is Paul as a Christian. It is Paul prior to conversion, or it's the representative of Jews in the flesh under the law, which is my, and there's arguments for all that, and that maybe you and I can get into that on another episode, but because I find it interesting that all of those are more probable. The least likely to be correct is Paul's talking about his Christian experience. But
I think so, personally, just in terms of context, lexicography, linguistic analysis, echoes, intertextuality, all that. I just don't find that to be compelling, personally.
Yeah. One of the things now, for a guy like Campbell, and he's kind of he's a heavy hitter. I think he's still at Duke, right?
Yeah, he's made full professorship at Duke Divinity.
Yeah. And so he's kind of a standard bearer, at least over here for this perspective. And what he sees in Romans 5 through 8, he says it doesn't quite square with what you find in Romans 1 through 4 if Paul is not representing someone else. He doesn't
Right.
see that there's. I don't have that problem. Because I know the problem he's kicking it back against. He says this doesn't seem like, like Paul's trying to unravel the number one, the individual with a guilty conscience, trying to assuage his guilt and find a
Yeah, he's reacting against the old perspective, or I mean, he's very reformed in his application of Paul. Like he's a Bardian Calvinist in terms of all that, but he's reacting against, we would say, kind of old school Puritan, high reformed, or even we might say particularistic Calvinism. He's got a universalist streak. I don't know, I wouldn't call him a universalist proper, but he's got that sort of streak in him.
But he also is reacting against what he doesn't. He thinks that Romans 5 through 8 is kind of so radical of a shift that the Jewish law court of Romans 3 and the retributive justice type idea of that I guess because of the way people haggle over propitiate, and all of that he doesn't see that can really be put together with what he finds Paul going on about in Romans 5 through 8. So that seems to be always my problem with that, though, is whether you hold to that or not, you can. I don't see enough for Paul to be going. I mean, speaking in two different voices, him and an interlocutor, because Paul is just as happy to quote. I mean, like you said earlier, he's got vice lists in 1 Corinthians and elsewhere, and he seems to be okay with echoing Second Temple texts like Wisdom of Solomon, which you get. I mean, chapters 14 and 15 are basically paraphrased in 18 through 30. What is it, 18 through 32 in chapter 1?
It's basically almost a Jewish decline of civilization narrative, how everything went wrong in a very compressed. Paul's very compressed and stuff like that. Whereas Wisdom of Solomon and a few other texts seem very happy to be like, no, let's have to spend a few chapters exploring this.
Yeah. So. But yeah, Paul seems to be okay with that himself. And to me, it seems like his purpose, though, is to levelize outsiders and Jewish insiders onto the same plane, to demonstrate how they can both be brought together in Christ. So that doesn't seem, because if you take chapter 2 as him, now some people are saying that his interlocutor in chapter 2 was what we could call a Jewish wannabe Gentile, but I'm not convinced of that yet either. That's a little bit weird, but just his Jewish leadership interlocutor in chapter 2, he seems to be going after that as well. Not so much to dismiss, ethnocentrism, but just to demonstrate that there's a universal need wider than just the deliverance of Jews finally and fully from what they would consider, they're an occupied people and all that. So I think that you can have all that without Campbell's insertion of prosopopoia, or however you say that word. I think that's as good as you said it the other night. So.
No, it's one of those things like, and I think the problem, and I'm not the only one that thinks this, of course, but the thing I've noticed with a lot of what Campbell does, at least with Romans, I mean, it's one of those things where I see people doing apocalyptic stuff, and it's basically Galatians and Romans. Yeah. And I'm sitting there going like, this is, I don't know, I get really annoyed when it's like, oh yeah, well, what about the pastorals? I mean, there's a debate on whether or not Paul wrote them. I'm inclined to think he wrote them. I could be wrong, but I'm inclined to think he wrote them. Yeah. So how does that fit in the scheme? And how does Colossians and Ephesians are very apocalyptic, can be interpreted in a very apocalyptic way. Right. Principalities and powers, and all these sorts of things. But it's like, for some reason, people really just fixate on Romans and Galatians. And I'm like, I don't know. Maybe I'm just a bad Pauline guy, but I don't find those epistles just to be very interesting to read, as opposed to Philemon or 1 Corinthians.
Right. So, well, you're saying out of the Pauline corpus, there's not a lot to go on that translates if you take that hard APP view. It doesn't go anywhere with his other epistles. Yeah. And then there's Catholic scholar. See, my memory's bad. What's the Catholic Pauline scholar that's
Fitzmar? Joseph Fitzmar?
No.
Luke Timothy Johnson?
Yeah, well, yeah, it might be Luke Timothy Johnson. No, Fitzmar, he wrote a Romans commentary, but it's really, really good one. Is that the Anchor one?
Yeah, that's the Anchor.
He wrote a good one. But no, I think I'm thinking of Luke Timothy Johnson, because I think I read in one of those Counterpoints books where he also makes the point that even this idea of sin and personal salvation and all of that doesn't even seem to be on Paul's radar when you take the whole corpus of Pauline studies. So if you take that view, that was not even his central concern.
Right. And you can see that. Throughout Romans, a good example of this sort of, I want to be careful how I say this, sort of very narrow, personalized, modernistic, personalized reading of Romans. I'm not saying scripture isn't personal or anything like that. But when we're doing historical research and we're bringing that to the church, we need to explain to the church, here's why history matters. It's not just a decontextualized text. And I saw that very clearly in the debate with Tyler Vela and John Cramden about Romans 9, and just this personalized emphasis on, the individual salvation versus the collective or the corporate view. And I'm sitting there watching going like, there's this whole debate between Calvinism and Calvinists and Arminians seems to center on the misplaced notion of an individual person getting right with God. And Campbell, I think, really repels against that, but I think he goes the wrong way of doing it. My response is basically, if we focus on divine activity, and I'm not talking about sovereignty or control or any of ththose sorts of things. I'm talking about how the way God acts in Romans and Galatians, you get a completely different picture, because then Paul is basically put God in a terrible spot, because, what shall we say, in all these things, there's no, all these principalities and powers can't take us. But what about God's own people, Israel? What about God's own faithfulness and word to them? You've just given us a great vision of God. And that's where I kind of buck heads with Campbell, is like, yeah, that's all great about Romans 5-8, but how does Paul incorporate that into Romans 9-11, which is one of his most painful discourses you'll ever read? Like, he's agonizing over Israel. And it's one of those things you kind of look at and go, to read Romans 9-11 and make it about salvation or personal salvation is such an anachronistic way of reading that it just completely, like, if you read that to Paul, I'm not saying Paul is a good Arminian or anything like that, but you read that to Paul, Paul's going to look at you like you got lobsters growing out of your nose. He's not going to look at you and take you. He's going to be like, what are you talking about? I'm addressing how a faithful God responds to human unfaithfulness. And it's about the character of this God, not about what the man-centered kind of nonsense that we see spewed, rhetorically all over the internet. It's like, no, how does this faithful God act? And that's where I think the Apocalyptic School has a good leg on a lot of this, is because it does focus on apocalyptic, or rather divine activity. And instead of punting it to eschatology, like in the future, it goes, no, the incarnation is an apocalyptic event that happened in history, the Gospel of John, the prologue, the word became flesh and dwelt, and all these sorts of things. And it says that is the prism by which we view everything. And that's not a Christian prism. That's a New Testament prism. Gotcha. And once you kind of get all that in mind, then the question of the individual salvation in the law court before God, and I'm not even knocking the law court idea. I think that it's present in some aspects, but to make that the whole point about what the gospel is just so, it's just an absolute bundle of malarkey, because Paul's just going like, no, how does this righteous, good God who's been faithful to Israel this entire time, even to a remnant, react to people refusing to be in participation and in covenant with him? And that's where I think it gets. That's where the Romans 9-11 becomes so powerful.
Yeah, and you get a taste of this for those who are interested in intertextuality. There's what was called a catena of passage. It's just a string of passage quotations, which you find in chapter 3 of Romans 10-18, right? And he marshals texts from the Psalms, and he marshals texts from Isaiah. And if you read those, even where it sounds like he's ripping humanity a new one with these passages, one right after another. If you read the wider context, is exactly what you're talking about, where how the divine activity, how does a faithful God respond? Because in the broader context of those passages, what you find is God moving to action and going to bring the right arm of salvation, as it says in Isaiah. You know, all of these passages where it seems like God is about to move, which paying attention to those intertextual cues, which is why verse 21 explodes even bigger than most people realize it does. You know, because of that buildup, not just of the negativity, but because of this divine activity that's in the wider context of those passages those texts that he cites in that passage. So for you, getting into Romans 5-8, what about Romans 5-8 sticks out for us to understand what the apocalyptic perspective is trying to aim at? And since we've kind of discussed already some of the issues with Campbell in chapters 1-4, what is it about in general, about 5-8 that gives us reason to rethink? But then how do you square that? And then how do you personally meet that with Romans 1-4 in a way that Campbell doesn't, if that makes sense?
Yeah, no, and big picture, what I see happening in Romans 5-8 is and maybe a good summarizing text is 2 Corinthians 5:11-21 is God in Christ has reconciled you. That's divine activity. That's an invasive incarnational event. God was in Christ reconciling the cosmos to himself, right? There's that divine activity. And then what does Paul say right after that? Reconcile yourselves with God. There is that human response, that human participation. I don't like the language of free will. I think it's too loaded. But what the apocalyptic school emphasizes rightly, I think, is the participationist nature of Pauline soteriology and sanctification and community. I don't know how they don't usually talk about community, but for me, it's like the idea of an individual being reconciled with God is not the same thing as what Paul is saying. Paul is talking about the sins of a group or a nation being brought back to God. And that includes individuals, but it doesn't have the individual in mind. The individual finds herself, for example, we would say in Christ or in Adam or in Israel and those sorts of things as a member of that particular entity. And what Paul is doing, I think, in Romans 5-8 is expounding upon what Christ has done to combat the destructive outcome of Adam and Eve's sin. If we take a massive kind of big picture narrative look, Romans 1-4 is the Adamic fallout of what happens when a nation, or rather a person, goes estranged from God and brings chaos and annihilation and destruction and corruption. It impacts the human bodies. It impacts our interpersonal relationship. It impacts even enmity between Jew and Gentile, as we see in Galatians 1-1 and 2, but also Romans 2, especially the tension between Jew and Gentile, and also the language of the interlocutor and the diatribe in Romans 3-1, all being under sin. And what the apocalyptic Paul says, I think is sin is not a personal little existential, abstract, metaphysical, pious thing that you do.
Yeah.
And includes that, but sin is a bigger organic agent. We would almost call it a power, and that's where death comes from, right? And so that's why when you'll see me writing stuff, I try to capitalize sin and death when they're bigger concept, because these are, as much as you can put say death is alive and thriving, it is. I mean, it seems contradictory, but death as a power is engaged against the world.
Well, you have to get that from, you get that from Paul himself in 5:12-21, where, if you're not trying to think in systematic theology terms, which people are, at least interested lay persons and armchair theologians and seminary students always, you have to deprogram them in biblical studies courses, because they're always trying to do the theological readings, so to speak. But when you read, sin is a reigning power. Sin reigns and death reigns. He's speaking of them as rulers, and it is sort of this idea of cosmic rulers. And of course, death reigning is why, that death figures as the last enemy, and Paul thought, I mean, so it's not like this, there's no textual basis for it. If you understand the way that he's speaking, just by the speaking of death in a way he's not talking about just a human being falling over dead, he's speaking of this idea that it's sin and death both are rulers. And so to me, it seems like what the apocalyptic perspective on Paul, if the old perspective or the Lutheran Paul is worried about the poor guilt-ridden sinner trying to find a way to make God happy, and it's okay because God killed Jesus so that you don't have to try, right? That's to caricature it, right?
Yeah.
I think N.T. Wright says God so hated the world he killed his son, kind of thing. Yeah. Which, if you hear certain preaching, that's what you would have to think, right?
That's what I heard growing up, preached from the pulpit of my old churches. I heard it.
Yeah. So there's that. But then the new perspective, I think their thing is they wanted to move away from that. But I think the charge against the new perspective that I think is right, is that it focused too much on the horizontal relations of human beings and less on the vertical dynamics of God. And then the apocalyptic perspective comes as a whole other thing that wants to emphasize, no, it's actually bigger than all of that. It's oh, sorry, if I sit too still, my hutch blocks the sensor, so this goes out. Trinity students have a lot of video lectures where it goes.
Were you just doing this over on the side?
Yeah. So that comes back and says, no, this is insofar, universal, cosmic, think grander, God, powers, human beings, all of this stuff happening at cosmic scale.
Yeah.
It's not just about God trying to fix human relations problems on the ground. And it's not God trying to just assuage a guilty feeling individual, which probably was not primary in the ancient world anyway. They weren't introspective or anything like that.
Not like that, no.
They were is a shame culture so much more than this I feel guilty thing. It's I stole and people found out. What are they going to think of me? It's not or
my family or my community or my town or my city or my nation.
Exactly. Yeah. Right. And how am I going to be identified in those lenses? Not so much as I feel terrible that I ripped that guy. No, that's not absent, but that's not primary concern, right?
Yeah.
So but the apocalyptic Paul wants to show this huge scale divine activity, cosmic powers, reigning and oppressing, and you have slaves of sin, right? I mean, that's personification of sin as a slave master, a slave driver driving human beings, and God's at war with all of that, and it's a radical invasion with the coming of Christ and his mission and all that. So I think that's a helpful corrective in that sense. And I think it gets Paul right there. My problem, again, is similar to yours, where I think it's trying to some perspective, some takes on this, not all takes, but some within that camp are trying to drive too much of a wedge between, okay, the old ideas are completely wrong and the new perspective missed its target. So in that spirit, I want to ask you, what do you think the new perspective got right? What do you think it gets wrong? And what do you think that the apocalyptic Paul fills up the shortcomings of the new perspective?
I think the new perspective got it right because it forced us to go back to Second Temple texts and read the New Testament as a document in a proper historical reality. And that's something we can thank E.P. Sanders or George Foot Moore or N.T. Wright or Jimmy Dunn. We can thank them, sleep in peace, Jimmy, he just recently passed away.
Did he? So, I did not hear that. Oh, that
maybe within a month. I forget exactly, but yeah, he recently passed away. Scott McKnight wrote a very moving obituary for CT and all that. So he recently passed.
He didn't ever retire, did he? I don't think he
in name, not in practice, from what I'm told.
Okay, because I was going to say I might, with his passing, I might be the only person left in any seminary anywhere who holds his view on speaking in tongues and acts as being a twofold uh, speaking and hearing miracle. Because everyone else says no, they spoke languages out of their own mouths that were the foreign language, and he said no to that, and I say no to that, and I think now that he's gone, I think I'm the only person left on planet Earth that holds that view.
I haven't done enough study on the gifts and the tongues and all that sort of stuff. So I've color me ignorant on that.
Yeah. But it was me and him. It's all. I mean, he was the biggest name scholar I could find that held that. But that's a shame.
Yeah, it is. But he leaves behind a great legacy of students and writing. So his Romans commentary, for all the stuff I disagree with it in, is still just he's a great read. He's anything you can find. He's spirited. He's fun. He's pretty charitable, even when you can tell he's being slapped, unfairly, say by D.A. Carson on the whole issue of the New Perspective. His response to D.A. Carson was a lot nicer than probably you and I would have been if we were in his shoes. But to get, I think what Jimmy and others got right was Paul's a Second Temple Jew writing in a Second Temple context, and we need to try and think of the ways that they thought. And that means we get away from rank individualism. We get away from kind of various questions that concern us, whether it's imputation or a forensic understanding of justification or dikaiosune and all that, getting away from that and letting the first century dictate the questions we ask. And I think as a hermeneutical device, as a way of interpreting or an epistemology, I think that is, it's vital. And that's why everyone now, with the exception of the aforementioned very few seminaries I mentioned earlier, accepts that. Even if even if they aren't in the New Perspective, even if they're Old Perspective, they still affirm that kind of idea of going back to the first century and letting the first century dictate the questions we ask of the first century before we move into modern evangelical or mainline theology, theological construction or constructive theology. What they got wrong, I think, is what you mentioned. They didn't have a big enough picture, or at least as it comes to Paul, as it relates to Paul. I don't think they had a big enough picture of how Paul conceived of the supernatural world. I think for Paul, with his personification of death and sin, his view of the final destruction of the powers and all of that in 1 Corinthians 15, or even the nature of resurrection, what that actually looks like in 1 Corinthians 15, that's still apocalyptic because it's divine activity. The Spirit is the one doing all of this. There is not and I think N.T. Wright, for all his dislike of the apocalyptic school, is an apocalyptic guy because he affirms what I would probably say, is kind of, you need a bigger picture in order to frame the stuff that's going on. And that bigger picture of the incarnational Christ event. I mean, I'm doing an article right now on prevenient grace, and as kind of a side, people love to start at John 1:19, the word coming in, enlightening everyone coming into the world. And Thomas Schreiner makes a big deal out of saying, well, the text doesn't say, prevenient grace and all that. I'm like, look, if you step back and you look at the entire prologue, what happens? The word came into the world and the darkness could not overpower it. That kata lambano language, suppress it, hold it down, overpower it. And it's like, that's an apocalyptic idea already. What it tells us, the nature of our world, how it's seen by the biblical authors, it's enshrined in darkness, it's oppressed, it's enslaved, it's being broken down by death and sin. And Christ is the light that invades, like the invasion at Normandy on D-Day, right? It's the tip of the spear into the darkness of the world, casting light out. And I think the New Perspective really lacked that kind of bigger epistemological framework to understand the bigger questions I think Paul is actually wrestling with: the faithfulness of God, how God acts, and the human place in that. And while I think they get right the synergistic kind of element of Paul's soteriology, that participation element, they don't extrapolate it further into kind of Christological and kind of functions like that. And so I think they actually get the horizontal dimension largely right. The problem is, I think by leaving out the vertical dimension of the cosmic, or I don't like to say the universal nature of what God is doing. I prefer to say the cosmic. I don't like to speak of universal atonement. I like to think of cosmic atonement. It's a bigger picture. And I think what the apocalyptic Paul gets right is they provide a bigger prism by which we can view these questions. The only problem is the apocalyptic school tends to eschew the first century in favor of the concept itself, which leads to abstraction and personalization and modernism or postmodernism. My response is no, the first century apocalyptic model that Paul provides in his epistemology wrecks all of that, because it basically says Paul had a vision in the first century that impacts us today. It's not a disjunctive thing to where the story ends. The story's completed and it's now continuing.
Gotcha.
And it has a telos to it and stuff like that.
Yes. Contrary to what some people may think of you that are in spheres of people that we know, you're actually on probably the most conservative end of the APP school there is.
Probably. I mean,
yeah.
If NT Wright is if you have EP Sanders, this is my left. EP Sanders here, you have Dunn, then Wright. Wright being on the right, I'd be where Wright is, but I'm within my overlap is I'm in the apocalyptic school, so I don't go as far as Campbell or Gaventa or all of them. I tend to be on the conservative side of the apocalyptic school, although I don't even know what that means.
Well, I'm not talking about like theological conservatism.
Okay.
I'm talking about in terms of continuity, discontinuity.
Oh, okay, gotcha. Yeah. Then yes, I would be. I did screenwriting for my undergrad, film writing, and so I'm inclined to see narrative, and I'm inclined to see there are shifts that happen within narrative. There's acts and epochs and all that sort of stuff. But I all see it as one big thing. If you're a good storyteller, it's all one story.
Right.
And I think Paul is operating with the Christ event is an act or a sea change within a grandmaster narrative that God is doing.
Right.
Not a separate movie that's starting over. It's not, it's not as if we are in The Empire Strikes Back and when Christ comes, boom, now it's Return of the Jedi. It's like, no, this whole thing is in the Star Wars universe.
Gotcha. Yeah. So that's one of the things that I think the critics of the APP, what you just said is the disjunct is too much. Sometimes it seems, at least with Campbell, you have to take things that sound reasonable to people like us anyway, who are familiar with ancient rhetoric, to try to bracket certain parts of Paul so that it's not Paul's voice, to make things go that I don't find necessary. That would be my only hang up, but I think, like you said, N.T. Wright could, in a sense, fit into that, because it reminds me of I guess 15 years ago. Okay, so the throes of the new perspective versus old perspective, they were fighting so much about just justification, really, and they were fighting so much
too.
Yeah, and imputation, and they were fighting about what kind of Judaism was second. Everyone understands it was never. No one ever claimed it was monolithic, but it seems like you mentioned D.A. Carson, one of the. I just find him unpleasant, but it seems like he went through so much effort with those 2 volumes to show that, and he didn't get there. I mean, the contributors were like, to be honest, I mean, it's exactly what the titles were, variegated, but they would, whenever they found something that they could kind of wave the banner for this slavish works-based, no grace kind of thing, they would take that as representative, knowing that their own research didn't support that, right? But I think that they all that got so into there that now, 15 years later, it's a different conversation. But it seems like the saner voices are trying to say there is a middle ground here where you can have an apocalyptic Paul that didn't see Judaism as a house that either needed to be burned down or just relativized and made irrelevant, because that's the story.
Yeah.
And so there's not too much discontinuity there. It just makes sense as the next plot point or the next plot twist even.
Yeah. And the big debate between Campbell and Wright, as I understand it, is not their disagreement, or it's not their agreement about all the tertiary stuff. The big disagreement is on what narrative is governing Paul, or Paul's epistemology. And for Campbell, it's much more of a, and it is in some sense a grace or spirit, Holy Spirit, grace spirit versus contractualism, kind of that forensic idea of justification where a sinner is legally declared to be in the right, and the books are closed kind of thing, you know, that law court imagery. Whereas Wright, and I think correctly, and this is why I think he's in the apocalyptic school myself, sees a master narrative that involves Paul's participation in the retelling of Israel's story in Christ, the waters of baptism, say through Sinai, and all the kind of the cosmic stuff that Christ does in Colossians and Ephesians, which the apocalyptic school has stayed away from those. I don't know why. It's like we're going to build a car and we've got the best engine in the world, but we really care what the leather smells like inside. It's like, guys, like you can make a really cool car with all of this, and there's been no major. But anyway, I'm sorry. So the big debate within Wright and Campbell is the nature of Paul's narrative, and that's where I'm like, I think Campbell just is. I think Campbell's too reactive against what he perceives, in some sense correctly, in some sense not correctly, of kind of the old perspective. Whereas N.T. Wright's like, here's a master narrative that can fit both. Right. And that's the thing where I think a lot of people they also bristle at the idea that Paul could have a master narrative to begin with, you know, and that's a whole other debate. But it's like, I mean, we all operate with stories. We live with stories, so.
Yeah. Now I do understand wanting to, with the part of me thinks that N.T. Wright would be happy to be considered in the apocalyptic school of thought if they called it something else. He just quibbles with the name a lot too. Which,
well, what they should call Campbell stuff is not apocalyptic. They should call it Bardian Paulinism.
Well, that's what N.T. Wright said too. Is our neo-Bardianism, but you know, Bart didn't get it all wrong either, though. That's what's so that's the problem with Pauline studies is it can be a labyrinth. You know, and for people who've never heard of any of this is going to be quite confusing. But I want to kind of shift gears to talk about just the debate on justification, since there is still within the new perspective and the apocalyptic perspective, that's still a discussion too. So that hasn't been settled yet either. Insofar, even people that you could say are quasi in the new perspective camp, you could say quasi there, like for Michael Bird, for example. I mean, he rejects imputation.
Yep.
You know,
I do too.
Yeah, I do too. That's a
21st. It's a 6th century question in search of a 1st century text.
Yeah. But justification. But I think I think that Bird's also not opposed to the transformation aspects of justification as not purely forensic category. So that's kind of a mess too for people. So let's just keep using Campbell as representative. So justification for the apocalyptic Campbell type, Douglas Campbell. I mean, he wrote a massive book on this. Yeah. And
it's too long. It should have been 2 books. It's endnotes too. It's like 1,000 pages of text, like 300 pages of endnotes. It's like a 1,400 page book, and it's endnotes, which to me, and he footnotes like Craig Keener or endnotes like he cites like Craig Keener cites. Yeah. And it's all endnotes, and I'm just sitting there going like flipping through. I'm just like, you know what? I'm not going to read this just on pure principle anymore. Like, and I've read the whole thing, but I'm just, it's like eating a 15-pound chocolate cake. It's just like, and as someone who's eating healthy and starting to work out a little more and try and get healthy, the very thought just makes me nauseous. So,
right.
But yeah, so I'm sorry. Yeah.
So, but everyone's still interested in justification. So if you haven't figured it out by now, along with all of relevant New Testament scholarship, Reformed Lutheran justification ideas are the non-starter for us. You know, that's okay. You need to go read more. So I'm sorry that sounds condescending, but this is Trinity Radio Extra, and Brax is not here to.
There's a little bit of extra spice. That's all it is. It's a little extra spice.
So because that's all just kind of, oh, that's cute that you don't understand the Bible. But for people interested in the topic of justification, hot button topic still, it's never goes away. Apocalyptic perspective, new perspective, and what perspective should, in Nick Quient's mind, people have on it?
So for the apocalyptic, the Campbell, after reading Campbell, I'm still not 100% certain how to classify his actual view of justification. But we can go with J. Lou Martin. J. Lou Martin taught at Union Theological Seminary. I think he was professor of biblical theology until he passed away a decade or two ago, I forget. Beverly Gaventa studied under him.
Oh, okay.
And so there's a huge, I think she did. She went to Union. I think she did.
And they're all APP school.
Yeah, they're all they're all APP school. And Raymond Brown taught there. So a lot of great people taught there, or at least within that kind of sphere. He translated it and tried to understand justification, Takai Sune, or as Douglas Moo didn't realize how funny it sounded when he was debating Doug Campbell on, he called it the Dick word group, because it's, the stem is the DIK, Takai Sune, Takai O and stuff like that. But he called it the Dick stem. And I'm just like, or the Dick word or something like that. And I just went, do you have, and my first thought was, if you've got a kid, you got to read this stuff to like a son or a daughter and have them be don't tweak that. But one of those things is I just oof.
But it's so innocent coming from Moo.
No, it is. And it's one of those where it's like, you're not even mad, you're not offended, you're just like, oof. Oh well. In that the Dikaya word group and all of that, what Martin did in his massive Galatians commentary, which is really good and really like it's like eating a really good piece of meat and finding a couple toenails in there. It's like, you're not.
That's a word picture that sucks. Wow.
Yeah, I know. But that's kind of how it is. It's like there's some stuff in there. Most of it, it's like, this is probably pretty good. This is really groundbreaking. It's really thought-provoking. Then there's a bite where you're not, kind of thing. But he argued that justification language should be understood in terms of rectification or making things right. Yeah. We would say something like reconciliation, which there is a word group, and that's in terms of lexemes, completely unrelated. In terms of semantic range and even meaning, we have a different word that Paul uses, but they see it in terms of the process of making things right. And so instead of having a forensic or a legal understanding where a sinner is declared, which is still a really imprecise way of talking, it's not as if it's like magic wanding it, I declare you righteous. It's like, well, that's not how it works, because that misses, as a new perspective pointed out, the horizontal element. That doesn't just wipe it all away. And especially, as you know, and I know, in a gift-giving culture and where there's economic and development and interpersonal relationships with all that, you can't just wipe that away. God can, but that's not the same as wiping it all away. So the Apocalyptic School basically argues, generally speaking, that justification has a participationist, interpersonal, reconciliatory nature. And so it may, depending on the apocalyptic person, it may include the notion of legal or forensic. But I think for them, it's fundamentally ethical and participationist. And so it tries to get away from the law court. And I think that's right, because I don't think Takaya Sune fits well with the law court. It pushes that over here and says, no, the idea of making things right or rectifying a situation, God rectifying the human relationship, the God-human relationship is central to it. And that's where they think of Romans 4, they think Romans 3 and 4. They also think of it in terms of, and this goes back to Ernst Käsemann, which as I learned German, what is it? Käse is cheese, so it's cheese, cheese man, Käsemann. That I was tickled pink when I read that or figured that out. But he argued that the righteousness of God, Takai Sune Theou, that famous genitival phrase, meant something like God's faithfulness displayed in character. Yeah. And it's something along those lines. And I think that also is because Käsemann is kind of the grandfather of kind of the apocalyptic movement. He may not have sired everyone, but everyone can kind of find find him as kind of their grandfather in that. And so they kind of view it in terms of that. And I think that's largely correct. I'm not willing to exclude the law court entirely, that kind of notion.
Because Paul sets up a judgment.
Right, right.
And that was the language, though. I mean, the verbal, Campbell seems to really press against that. I'm kind of like, well, if Paul uses it that way, then we need to figure out. Well, not just Paul, but that just records from the ancient world, that was kind of their language. So, I mean, you just got. So, I think what they're aiming at is not. Well, no judge on earth in Israel ever uttered that word, because you can't make that claim. But what they're I think what they're really after is that, because they're really big on the notion of the love of God when we're talking about divine activity, that is an active thing. And I think that they're pushing against the law court stuff simply as an overreaction to it. Well, I think you actually, yes, I think that's 100% true.
I think the implicit thing, and I had this with a conversation with someone I know about atonement, is the notion of there's kind of this implied, and the thing with Pauline theology is you touch one thing here, the whole web shakes. That's in Pauline studies. And so, I mean, even especially if you're doing Pauline theology, right? What we've noticed is implicit in all of this, and it's not been brought up, and that's not our fault or anything, but it doesn't get brought up, is what is the nature of the atonement? Because that will dictate how we understand the God-human relationship, especially in the God-Christ-human relationship. If you believe in retributive justice, if you believe in all these sorts of kind of things, then that will color what you think justification is or righteousness language is. And it's kind of one of those things I'm noticing the more I do study on this is like your view of atonements, oddly enough, will impact how you view a lot of these other issues in Pauline theology.
Right.
And I affirm substitutionary atonement wholeheartedly. I have issues with the penal aspect because I don't find it to be well grounded in the text. That's not to say I couldn't be convinced otherwise or anything like that. So I'm not even opposed to retributive justice or anything like that. So I'm not even on that train. What I find difficult is what people kind of bring to the discussion of justification is the notion of someone somewhere needed to be punished.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, no, because if we read the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus forgives people all over the place without needing, justification or retributive justice or anything.
Yeah.
But what I think a lot of people bring to the conversation is an assumption of I'm a guilty, wretched, awful worm of the sinner, because there's a sort of piety in that, I'm a guilty, awful, horrible, wretched sinner, and God is the judge declaring me innocent because of Christ. And it's like, well, if that's your picture, if all you have, and I'm not saying you can't have the law court, but if all you have is the law court, then justification looks like the judge slamming the gavel down and declaring you innocent when he should have declared you guilty because of Christ. And if that's all you have, then you'll see that in a few instances in Paul, but that basically runs you into the risk of doing the whole the gospel coalition stuff, right? The gospel is not, my gospel is the resurrection of Christ, son of David, right? And I'm paraphrasing 2 Timothy 2:8, right? This is my gospel. The gospel is not the resurrection of Christ. It is a specific theory of atonement or model of atonement that gets pushed into the discussion on justification because you need the both of them to kind of talk together in order to get, the wretched sinner, the God punishing, the atonement, contractualism and the construct and all that. Yeah. And it's one of those things where there's so much implicit conversation going on that we're not even aware of it. And an example I used, and I'll stop talking, is the idea of a massive, I don't know if you have these out in Indiana, and where I grew up in Southern California, the huge freight train would come down from San Diego or Los Angeles or Long Beach, pass through our area, and then head down to San Diego. But it's a massive freight train that took 15, 20 minutes to go by at 10 miles an hour. And it's almost as if, and I think this happens for a lot of us, each one of the one engine on that train is pulling a lot of theological freight. And unless we stop and pick that train, that engine up and look at it and go, what is this bringing into the station? We need to question that. What are the assumptions brought in with this train? Because if you just, oh yeah, I accept the whole train. Well, no, you're not accepting the train. You're accepting the train plus the 500 cars of history and theology and tradition and exegetical stuff that's all being assumed in this whole train. It's like, no, we need to stop and go back, as the New Perspective rightly pointed out, looking at everything as a piece of a puzzle, not forgetting that we are talking about a massive puzzle, but look at each piece individually before we just start slamming it in and going like, yes, this is how this all works. And I think we see a lot of that in the justification talk because there's a lot of theological freight that's just unjustified. And I'm not even saying it's all wrong. I'm just saying we need to get back to the source of actually thinking more clearly and all of that.
Yeah, so I'm a little bit more friendlier to penal substitutionary atonement than you are, but I'm okay with it insofar as when we talk about the pieces of that puzzle, you got to put them in the proper space. And one of the things I appreciate about the apocalyptic perspective on Paul is the bringing in of the cosmic dimensions to this, even to the point of where justification, that if all you have, like you said, is guilty or innocent, oh, you're guilty, but Jesus makes you innocent, so cool. If that justification understanding is too small, just like penal substitutionary atonement is too small for what atonement is. It doesn't, it's not even the main thing. And I know some people say, well, it is the main thing. Well, that's because you're individualist centered. You need to get yourself off the hook from hell or whatever however you frame your whatever you emphasize in your soteriology. Now, I'm like you, I'm fine with the law court. I think Bird's right that justification is not merely a legal, but you can't just throw all transformative things to sanctification. There's aspects of this participationist idea in justification. It is individual and corporate, for sure. There's that dimension, but so I think Campbell is right to push back on what he dubs justification theory, because when you talk about the Gospel Coalition earlier, I mean, they can say the gospel is justification by faith. No Jesus in that sentence at all, right? I mean,
no resurrection in that sentence.
Yeah, no resurrection. It could be Bill from North Little Rock who died for your sins for all justification. Believe in Bill.
Well, it's like, I push back on my Reformed brothers and sisters. I'm like, hey guys, like, if you can't have any argument about justification or atonement theory or anything, because that presupposes a New Testament to ground the conversation, and you don't have a New Testament without the resurrection of Jesus.
Right.
Which means the resurrection of Jesus is at the center, implicitly or explicitly, of all of New Testament epistemology. You don't have that, you can't even talk about a New Testament to debate over. So justification and atonement and all the, it is the gospel. It's not. Jesus' resurrection is the gospel. Thereby, you can have important conversations about all the stuff that you like, that drives your denomination or your ideas or your convictions and all that. But if you don't have the resurrection of Jesus grounding the conversation, then egalitarianism is the gospel, Johnathan. Egalitarian. If you're non-egalitarian, you don't affirm the gospel. It's like, what nonsense. I mean, I think it's important. I affirm it. I preach it. I teach it. All that. But it's like, how arrogant to say this one little second-tier issue in Christian theology that I'm very passionate about somehow encapsulates all that Jesus came to do. It's like, no, sorry, not going to happen.
No, the Gospels are the gospel, and the microcosm of that, you don't get what did Jesus rise from? Okay, you need the resurrection to see what killed him. Just have him come back. The resurrection is like you say, the epistemological key to that. And I think that gets overlooked because people would rather focus on dogmatics than they would actually the story of King Jesus himself. So that's a problem that we still find. And I know you picked on the Reformed camp, and I'll pick on them too here as well, because for all of their talk about exegesis, it's rare that you find someone like a Michael Bird or someone from that tradition that demonstrates they've actually done their homework to do exegesis. Because exegesis, we say, well, it's just pulling out from the, extracting out from the text. It's me. Yeah, but if you don't have a mind soaked in not just the language is that's one small part of everything you need to know about the social world and the cultural world of the Mediterranean, and then find where these authors, the biblical authors of the New Testament, their ideologies, which are different. Peter had a totally different ideology than Paul.
Yeah.
So you have to do all of that homework, and I think, and because the way scholarship works, that homework gets bigger and bigger, and there's as discoveries are made, as we're rethinking old categories to try to make sure we're reading through ancient categories and not 2,000 years of theological reflection, a lot of which is good and a lot of which is right, but it doesn't help us unpack these texts on their own terms. So you gotta filter some of that stuff out so that you can filter other stuff in as you're reading ancient documents.
Yeah, and I use the phrase, the text should dictate to you in a large sense, not the whole sense, but in a large sense, the questions you ask. Yeah. The text should dictate or guide you to think better about the questions you ask. So if you come to 1 Timothy 2:12 and your first thought is who can be a pastor in your modern Baptist church as Baptist, if you come and do that, then you're going to have a completely different thing in mind than someone who goes to the text, whatever they believe, and go, what is the text trying to communicate, and how, and what questions arise for me out of that? Not, oh, I need to know who can be a pastor in my local church, I need to go to this. And it's like, no, the text should be the thing that plants the seeds for the questions that you'll ask. not the other way around. And I think a lot of evangelical scholarship has gotten it backwards because, I mean, let's face it, we're already coming to the text with bias, but let's face it, the historical grammatical method is not the only method in terms of theological reflection and construction in history. It can help. It can tell you what a text says, but it can't tell you what it means, or at least at any significant depth.
Yeah, well, that's the funny thing about everyone talks about grammatical historical hermeneutics, but that's just blowing smoke in a lot of ways, because most people, what they say is grammatical historical hermeneutics really doesn't put any emphasis on the historical part, and then they try to read metaphysics into grammar. And so what you end up with is what you started with, and it's not grammatical historical hermeneutics at all. What it is theological interpretation and mystical readings that you've from traditions.
If you're a Christian, you're going to do theological interpretation. The question is, are you going to do it well, and are you going to be aware of it?
Right. Well, that's why I like the Robin's socio-rhetorical method, where you have 5 layers of textures of the text, and then what was his name? Wrote the James Jude commentary. He added a 6th texture.
Peter Davids, maybe?
No, hang on just a second. Another break.
Okay. Let's see if I can find it before him. Was it James or Peter?
William Brosand.
Oh, yeah, okay.
So he added that 6th homiletical texture after the sacred texture to that methodology. And so what I like about that method and why I preach it is because it forces you to look at first the intertexture, just let the text create the world for you, then mine it for intertextuality, and then make sure you have enough knowledge for the sociocultural texture of it. Then make sure you have enough knowledge to understand the ideological texture, and then you can get to the sacred texture, or what does this tell us about God, man, our relationship with God, what God wants us to do, and all of that. And then, of course, Brosand added the homiletical texture, which is, now this is how you share it with others, whether you're preaching or teaching. And I think going through that way of doing it at least gives you a framework to make sure you don't leave anything out. But what it also does is it gives you a ton more homework to do, because intertextuality, most people just think, oh, that's whenever the New Testament quotes in Old Testament. Well, it doesn't just quote the Old Testament. It'll echo, it'll allude. So you need to know your Bible. But guess what? It echoes and alludes all kinds of non-canonical literature as well. It's all over the place, even if it doesn't directly cite it. So, that forces people, that method forces people to really dig deep and mine the text. And thankfully, it's not an individual project. There's resources available. We're all working on this. And we can't all do all of it. So that's good. But I think, just to give my concluding thoughts on this, I think that like the New Perspective was in its time with Sanders, I think the apocalyptic perspective, every time a new thing comes, it's all bombastic, like Luther when Luther came along, right? But they
don't like Luther too. Well, they like and don't like Luther,
right? But when he swung a big bat, right? Mm-hmm. And then, of course, the Reformed tradition had to temper some of that. And then comes along Sanders swinging a big bat and others. And then others come along and temper that. I like it when these schools of thought swing a big bat, if for no other reason, it shakes us out of our collective dogmatic slumbers and forces us to rethink, see where, of course, there's going to be some overreach and, or whatever. There's going to be some things, points of agreement and disagreement. But it keeps giving us more information that we can use to challenge our thinking about these texts. And I agree with you. The worst parts of it is the modernist and postmodernist aspects of it that seems driven more by modern concerns rather than ancient ones. That is a fair knock. And the same way that a knock against the New Perspective would be, it's too horizontal and not vertical enough, the God-man dynamics. And then the Old Perspective is just wrong. Yeah. But I mean, I like that these things come along because they always drive us back to the text. Now, because of the information age, these things hit a lot sooner to the masses than they used to. but it still always lags behind for the layperson than it does in academia. Thankfully, that lag time's less and less now because of the information age, and scholars are everywhere running around on the internet, which is, I think, a good thing overall. It can lead to some confusion, but you have people like us to wade you through all that, because unfortunately we have to read you had to read that big 1,700 page book that could have been written in 400 pages.
Yeah, a 400-page book on method, and
Yeah.
then a 300-page commentary on Romans 1 through 8. I think that would have been a great book by Campbell. But
Yeah. And he would have made more money with 2 books.
yeah, exactly. That was my first thought. I was like, he's not a good capitalist. He's just
Yeah. Well, he goes to Duke after all. I mean, you know, he's a professor there, so he may not even care for that. But yeah, those are my thoughts. So what are your thoughts on all of this? And we'll close it up.
Yeah, no, I think the apocalyptic school swings a mighty heavy bat. And my concern is it does so and it misses the Jewishness of Paul. It misses the Jewishness of the New Testament. Maybe Luke, but I think probably most of the authors, if not all the authors, are Jewish. It misses on the particularity of culture that involves Jewish theology and minds, or theologies even, and mindsets. It doesn't take into account those sorts of things very well. But what I think it does, and I think this is why because I think Jewish apocalyptic theology and thought was already coordinate with Paul. I mean, Paul, I think, would be very at home with Enoch, or some of the parts of the Sibylline oracles and others. I think Paul would have been very at home with all of that. And so what I look at the apocalyptic school doing well is it adds personification. It adds a cosmic and supernatural element that a lot of people either downplay or miss or don't care about, because, we're good mainline theologians. We don't have to worry about demons and powers and death.
Right.
Just feel nice in your heart and do nice things, and then you're fine. And I think the apocalyptic school adds a level of agency and urgency and malevolence to our world. And what I mean by that, it actually suggests strongly that death is not something that happens to a physical person when they die, or a person when they die. It's not just some spiritual abstract, like it's separation from God or something like that. It's not just some sort of pious thing. It's an actual carnivorous enemy that is seeking to destroy and bring to nothing. And it paints a dramatic vision of history and of eschatology that says God has acted in Christ to bring all things back to the way they are meant to be, in participation and communion with God and a renewed creation and all of that. And it doesn't isolate the individual sin, although it does include it. And it places the work of Christ at the center of all things. It places the Christ event properly where it should be for Christians.
And all of that is good things.
Very good things.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, the apocalyptic school, at its best, without its excesses or its misconstruals, places Christ at the center of history, and it incorporates the best aspects of the new perspective, because it recognizes if you are reconciled to God, or if God has reconciled us to God through Christ, and we are therefore to reconcile ourselves back to God in that, excuse my Wesleyanism, that participation is synergistic relationship, because God has acted divine action. The human has the capacity to respond to the object of faith, namely Christ. And therefore, because you have been reconciled with God through Christ, you can therefore look at the pneumatic reality of interpersonal relationships horizontally and begin to repair and reconcile those two. And that's where the nature of the church comes in. The church as a reconciling place of sinners who are seeking perfection and sanctification and peace to one another. And I think the apocalyptic school paints a beautiful picture of what theology can and should be, and it's grounded in the first century text of the New Testament, properly understood.
All right. So where can people find more Nick Quient? They should, and they should find more of you. So where can they find you?
Well, you'll find this funny. Today, I got my royalty notice from Whippenstock for my book, The Perfection of Our Faithful Wills, and I sold 60 copies of that. So I'm very surprised by that. I thought I only sold half of that, according to Amazon. So that was kind of cool. Didn't make much, but I just thought it was kind of cool. So they can find that book if they want to see an exercise in Pauline theology through the lens of a Wesleyan view of apocalyptic sanctification and entire holiness and all of that. They can find me on Twitter at Nick Quient, which is just my last Quient. I tweet sometimes when I shouldn't, and many times when no one's listening or cares. And I have 2 podcasts that I really should do more on. We have a couple episodes in the bag for one of them, but we got to wait for them. One is called the Synergists Podcast, spelled the Sinner way, SINNER, and following. We're going through a series on atonement right now. So if you like kind of what you heard, or at least you're bothered or you're annoyed by it, start listening to that series on atonement, and it might help clarify a few things. And also my wife and I do ministry through the Split Frame of Reference podcast on iTunes and all of that, where we go through text on scripture and Christology and gender and argue for an egalitarian understanding of not only of husband and wife relationships, but also of the church. So if that tells you a little bit too much of what my theology is, then I don't care.
There you go. Nick Quient, ladies and gentlemen, dear friend of mine. Thank you so much for doing this. I hope you come back. We've got other topics to discuss. I hope people will get your book. But before you go, what is one book that you would recommend this week if they are interested in the apocalyptic perspective on Paul that's readable for most people?
It'd probably have to be that four views book on the Apostle Paul, edited by, I want to say, Mike Bird. You get Campbell in there, you get Luke Timothy Johnson, you get Tom Schreiner, and you get Mark Nanos, Nanos. It's limited. It's more focused. I don't think Campbell does a particularly great job of articulating the apocalyptic Paul. But to Campbell's credit, there's stuff he writes in there that I know he has changed his mind on, specifically women in the Deuteropaulines and stuff like that. So he's actually become more, quote, conservative, or moved further to the right on that. So
and he's actually, I would recommend that too. That way you can kind of see where that view fits with all of the other perspectives on Paul. But Campbell is actually pretty good in the rebuttals.
Yes, Campbell shines in the rebuttals.
Right. So even if his positive case is not to your liking, I do want to say that the reason why you can't just say, well, this is not what I'm familiar with, so I'm going to screen it all off, is because if you read the rebuttals, you find out why some of it, at least what we've talked about as the best parts of it, are necessary because of the weaknesses of, say, the old perspective and even the new perspective, which I know that a lot of people in our audience are more friendly to the new perspective. And I am too, but I still have my quibbles with it. But you and I, we're guys who will quibble with everything.
I mean, that's how you make a living in New Testament scholarship, is quibbling.
Right. Well, now it's over the minutiae.
Quibbles for breakfast.
Right. There you go. Well, that's all that's left because everyone else has already had the big thing. So we get the minutia. But anyway, so thank you for watching Trinity Radio Extra. We'll see you next time. God bless.